availability with Exchange using database availability groups. I'm Tom Rizzo. I work at Amazon. I run the Windows EC2 business, so any feature requests, any sort of things you'd like to see us do, please let me know. When you fire up a Windows EC2 instance, that is my team that actually does that work. So thank you for your business, but we always want to improve and make AWS the best place to run Windows and Windows workloads. Before coming to Amazon, I actually worked at Microsoft for 18 years. So I worked in the Exchange team, the SQL Server team, the SharePoint team, and the Office 365 teams. So I know a little bit about the Microsoft workloads. And any questions you have, I'm more than happy to answer. But I will also defer to my old friends at Microsoft for some of the other questions that you may have. And as I said, I have my email address at the end of the slides. So you'll get a copy of these slides. Please feel free to email me anytime that you want. I will try and answer your question, or if you have a feature request or any of those sorts of things. But I'm excited to talk about Exchange and SharePoint. We do get a ton of questions around how do I take my on-premises Exchange, SharePoint, move it to AWS, or have a hybrid deployment where I have some Exchange on-prem, some Exchange online, or some SharePoint on-prem, some SharePoint online. So I'm going to give you some ideas. I have a bunch of demos, so I really want to show you the stuff working inside of the Amazon cloud. Please save your questions for the end, and as I said, I'll stick around, answer questions here or in the booth as the day progresses. Just some quick background. A lot of people don't know that Amazon actually runs Windows and Windows workloads pretty well. So I have a quick sort of quiz here on what do all these things have to do with Amazon. Oil discovery, $840 billion. That is not the revenue for AWS. I wish it was, but unfortunately it is not. Mad Men and Tennis's Andy Murray. Can anyone tell me? All customers running Windows on AWS. Every one of these workloads is running on top of these slides. Hello. OK. PowerPoint's not my friend today. That's right. The Office. I used to work in the Office team, so maybe it knows. So Shell, Lionsgate, who does the Mad Men, recovery.gov. If you want to see a SharePoint for internet sites running on top of AWS, just go hit www.recovery.gov, and you can go see where all the money's spent on the Stimulus Act. Same thing with treasury.gov. That all runs on SharePoint on AWS. So internet-facing sites on SharePoint. Lionsgate runs SharePoint for their intranet sites on AWS. And then finally, the USTA, which I believe they have a session tomorrow here at the conference, they also run their SharePoint environment inside of the AWS environment. Banro runs Exchange, 400 mailboxes of Exchange. Choice Logistics has a couple hundred mailboxes of Exchange. So you may not know it, but customers are already running the Microsoft workloads, mission-critical production Microsoft workloads on top of the AWS cloud today. And that's just a little bit of the list. There's obviously more than that running on top of the AWS cloud. So without further ado, though, I will start talking about migrating SharePoint to AWS. I just wanted to give you a couple of things to think about in terms of evaluating and migrating SharePoint to AWS. There's a couple of things. Since SharePoint is a multi-tier application, obviously there's a web tier, an application tier, and a database tier. You're going to want to think through all those different application tiers as you migrate them into the AWS environment. This is crazy. OK, this thing stinks, officially. Number one, do you want to move all or part of your SharePoint environment into the AWS cloud? I've had customers do some of it, all of it. It really depends on what your workloads actually are. And it depends on whether you're running intranets, internets, or extranets. SharePoint can run all those different modes inside of AWS. It really is your choice in terms of the different ones that you want to actually run. When you're dealing with intranets, you're probably going to set up VPC and VPN, because you probably will have your Active Directory. So let me talk about Active Directory for a minute, since both SharePoint and Exchange require it. In AWS, we don't care where your Active Directory actually exists. Your Active Directory could be on-premises, and then you use our virtual private cloud and a VPN connection back into your on-premises AD, and you can do all your authentication and authorization inside of on-prem AD, but SharePoint is running inside of the Amazon cloud. You can have a sort of mixed mode where you have on-prem AD and possibly a read-only domain controller running inside of the AWS cloud so that you can authenticate inside of the AWS cloud, but you do all your writes into the on-prem AD, and you're just replicating from on-prem AD into a read-only domain controller inside of the Amazon cloud. Or you can fully move your Active Directory into the Amazon cloud. Now, for Active Directory SharePoint, today we do offer CloudFormation scripts. So if you want to just try and evaluate AD or SharePoint, just do a search for CloudFormation and SharePoint, or CloudFormation and Active Directory. Click of a button will deploy a stack and SharePoint will be deployed, and Active Directory will be deployed. And we have just released recently for SharePoint the ability to do a multi-instance deployment of SharePoint. So you'll get a AD, you'll get SQL, you'll get SharePoint deployed across multiple instances. So we really do allow you to do a lot when it comes to CloudFormation. We want to try and make it as easy as one-click sort of deploy into the AWS cloud for a number of the Microsoft workloads. When it comes to internet sites, there's a lot more that you have to think around in terms of the SharePoint environment, because it is more of what I'll say, a complex environment, because you may have a staging server, you may have a production server, you may have an authoring server, and you have to deploy between those things. So that's how you have to think about, do I keep those on-prem? Do I move those online? How do I connect them? How do I put out my IP address to the general public, my DNS? All these sorts of things, and how do I make them highly available? The other thing that we've seen on internet sites for SharePoint is SharePoint itself does some caching for performance for most commonly used sort of images and pages. But the other thing you may want to think about is also using things like CloudFront, our CDN network, where you can take some of the static images that may not change on your internet site or even on your intranet site and actually put those into the CDN so that they're actually appear very, very quickly inside of the SharePoint environment. And then finally, extranet. This one, I think, is one area where AWS shines because it's a public cloud. When I talk to customers who run SharePoint on premises, they struggle with extranets because people don't want external parties punching into their corporate environment in order to be able to share information with a third party. They don't want to maybe add them to their Active Directory environment, right? They maybe want a publicly accessible sort of endpoint for those third parties. And so by hosting inside of AWS, by its nature, you do have a publicly accessible endpoint if you want for creating extranets. Now again, the way you authenticate against the extranet, whether you use ADFS and actually do Active Directory Federation services to the other side of the house for credentials, or whether you store those third-party credentials for your partners inside of your own AD is really up to you. But we fully do support extranets inside of AWS for the SharePoint environment. We talked a little bit about the identity and authentication down there. One thing I will point out when you're working with SharePoint is the user profile sync. It does have special requirements. A lot of customers say, maybe I don't want to use Windows-based authentication with SQL Server on the back end. I want to use SQL Server-based authentication on the back end. You will run into issues with user profile sync, whether you're on-prem or inside of the AWS cloud. So that's something to think about when it comes to your SQL Server authentication and whether you use Windows or SQL-based auth. For high availability, so in AWS, we support multi-AZs and we have regions. Right? We would recommend the way that you deploy all of your tiers inside of SharePoint would be into a multi-AZ environment. So you've got, let's say, US East 1A and US East 1B. You would deploy web servers in both. You would deploy database servers in both. And you would have the application tier for SharePoint in both. On the back end for SQL Server, we would recommend that you use something like SQL Server Database Mirroring. Or in SQL Server 2012, you can use SQL Server Database Availability Groups so that if the SQL Server dies in one AZ, you'll fail over to the other AZ and continue with that SQL Server. So I would definitely take a look at the high availability features inside of there from a multi-AZ deployment. And if you do use our CloudFormation templates, you can actually deploy those into a multi-AZ environment. So take a look at how we do it through the CloudFormation templates, and you can see how we do it inside of our scripts. The other big question that I normally get when it comes to SharePoint and thinking about SharePoint moving it to a cloud-based environment is, what about custom development? I want to customize SharePoint. I want to build web parts. Maybe I want to build workflows. Maybe I want to build different capabilities into the SharePoint environment. The nice thing about AWS is that it is full SharePoint, right? So you can decide what sort of trust level you want to give application developers inside of your SharePoint deployment. We don't limit you in any sort of way. So SharePoint has two capabilities when it comes to custom development. You can either deploy what's called full trust, which means that that person has full trust on that server. They can do very bad things if you allow them to. Now, there's ways you can lock it down in SharePoint, but it will take work on your behalf. But in terms of full trust, that person, if you allow them, they can access the local disk. They can access the network. They can go and run an infinite loop, and so the SharePoint page actually never loads inside of there and times out. So full trust is one of these things that you'll want to make sure you verify the source, whether you're running on-prem or inside of the AWS cloud, and when you're actually developing your applications. Or SharePoint has this capability called sandbox solutions, where it's a limited sort of set of functionality for custom development. You are sandboxed into a set of things that you can do. You can't access disk. You can't access network. The SharePoint will kill you off if you try to do an infinite loop on the thing. So it really is just a sandbox capabilities. But again, it is a subset of the SharePoint development environment. So you may not be able to build a certain class of applications on top of the sandbox solution technologies. And finally, storage. Right? SharePoint builds on top of SQL Server. So you're going to have to deploy SQL Server in some reasonable way. But the other thing that customers think about too when thinking about moving to AWS is, what about S3? Right? SQL Server, SharePoint has this capability called Remote Blob Storage. RBS is the technology that we built. And you can offload the blobs, the binary objects. Usually those are Office documents, right? Word, Excel, PowerPoint, OneNote, Visio, PDF, those sorts of blobs. You can offload those to another system using that RBS technology inside of the SharePoint environment. There are a number of third-party solutions that allow RBS to go into things like the file system. So you could store the metadata only inside of SharePoint, and then the actual blobs are maybe stored in cheaper sort of file system storage. But there are solutions out there. StoragePoint comes to mind as one of the ISVs that actually does it, that allow you to store into Amazon's S3. So if you want to have a highly durable storage for blob storage, you can go and run these third-party solutions or build your own solution so that the binary large objects are not stored inside of the SQL Server environment, but are actually stored in something like an S3 environment. And then I bet, I don't have any inside knowledge here, I bet a bunch of those ISVs will also start looking at the Glacier technology, where you may say, great, for compliance reasons, I need to store these documents for 20 years, but I don't want to pay for online storage all the time inside of EBS or S3. I want to move it to cold storage like Glacier, where I'm paying a penny a gig. Well, you can guess over time there probably will be ISVs that will allow you to do that, or from a custom development standpoint, you can do that yourself. So move those binary large objects over into sort of a Glacier environment. Now, RDS, hopefully, how many people have heard of RDS for SQL Server? Show of hands. Not that many. OK. So when we were building, we ship the SQL Server Omni. So you can go up to AWS today. You can say, fire me up a Windows instance with SQL Server Standard, or SQL Server Express, or SQL Server Web Edition. For SQL Server Enterprise, you do have to bring your own license. But that's just SQL Server. You have to manage the high availability. You have to manage the backup and restore. You manage everything, right? You have to manage the scale, all those sorts of things. RDS for SQL Server, think of it as Managed SQL Server by Amazon, or Managed Oracle, or Managed MySQL. All you do is you just give us an instance. You say, I want to go fire up this instance of SQL Server. Here's the name of my SQL Server environment, and that's an endpoint then that you can connect to. And we manage the backup, the restore, all those capabilities inside of the SQL Server environment. Now, today, we do not support RDS for SQL Server with SharePoint. It's feedback that we've heard. We'll take a look at possibly supporting that in the future. I won't guarantee that we will. But if you try, I don't want you to spend your time trying to fire up RDS for SQL Server, and then try and connect SharePoint to it. It will not work today. So when you're evaluating, you will need either an on-prem sort of SQL Server or an AWS SQL Server to connect to in order to make the environment work. All right, I've done a lot of talking. Let me do a quick demo here, and then I'll move on to Exchange, because I've already eaten up almost 15, 20 minutes here. Very quickly. So this is, for those of you who haven't seen, this is SharePoint 2013. I won't go through all the new features of SharePoint 2013. There's a lot inside of there. This is running inside of AWS, right? So this is, I'm just RDP'd into my EC2 instance running SharePoint 2013. I have SQL Server installed locally inside of here. I have Active Directory all in the same box, right? I didn't set up a highly available demo here, but you will see that when we go talk about Exchange. And then I just want to show you that SharePoint 2013 works perfectly fine. You can come in, you can create your team sites. This is the new UI inside of here for SharePoint 2013. One of the things I pushed for and that was actually added to SharePoint 2013 is drag and drop of documents into a document library. Right? For those of you who've used SharePoint Upload, no longer do you have to go and click Upload File and go find it. Now you can just drag and drop now into SharePoint, which is a nice feature. But one of the major questions that we get around SharePoint and AWS is, how can I integrate the two together? Right? What is the value of me running SharePoint in the AWS environment? Maybe I want to take advantage of some of the other services, like let's say S3 inside of my SharePoint environment. So there's a couple of things that you can do. For those of you who don't know, we actually are fully supportive of .NET inside of AWS. We ship a SDK for .NET. We ship tools inside of Visual Studio for .NET developers. So I'm not going to geek out 100% on the developer stuff. If you want to geek out on the developer stuff, come to my session later today on Windows and AWS. But this is Visual Studio 2012 running inside of AWS. You'll see right here, there's a reference here to the AWS SDK. So as a .NET developer, I can just go add in the AWS SDK right into the Visual Studio environment and start writing code just like I do against SQL Server or Exchange or SharePoint. It's a fully featured environment. We fully support the Visual Studio environment for .NET developers. Here, I just wrote, SharePoint has this capability inside of Visual Studio to create web parts. All I did here was create a visual web part. It's not that exciting of a web part. But you can see here, I allow people to upload from S3 right inside of my SharePoint environment. And here I go and I just create an S3 client. I tell it I want to do a new put request up there. I grab the file, I get the bucket, and then I actually just upload this. In probably 15 lines of code here, I can go from taking a document and actually uploading it either from SharePoint, the file system, right into my S3 environment. So we are fully supportive of the Microsoft stack inside of here. And directly from inside of Visual Studio, I can go and deploy this into my actual SharePoint environment. I've already done this. This will reset SharePoint. SharePoint will take 30 seconds to come back up. I won't take those 30 seconds to actually do that. I'll just go back to this team site. To show you that I'm not like smoke and mirrors in this thing, we'll first go to the S3 management console inside of AWS. These are the files that I've uploaded already. So EC2 wallpaper, these text documents, right? This is the bucket, SharePoint Tom Rizzo. I will refresh, so you don't think this is Vegas, so you may think I'm sort of a magician, like Lance Burton up here, faking it out. But I'll refresh. You see all the documents there, nothing up my sleeves. I'll go back to this team site, and directly inside of my SharePoint environment, I added in that web part. Right? You can make it look much prettier than what I have here. I'll go and browse, and let's go to my documents here on my local file system. Again, I could browse to SharePoint if I wanted to, but I'll just grab something from the local file system in the interest of time. You'll see I have this reinvent.rtf here. I'll just click Open. I'll click a button, Upload to S3. Give it a couple seconds. If it's successful, this little label will change and tell me it's been successful. There we go. File uploaded, right? Pretty amazing. And then you see this reinvent.rtf down here to show you that I'm just not feeding it into the text box and faking it out again. Whoops. I will come up here to my S3 bucket, refresh this guy, and there you go, reinvent.rtf. Right? So as I said, that wasn't very complex code. That wasn't super, super difficult stuff. But here you can see a quick example of how, in sort of a pure Microsoft environment, SharePoint, Visual Studio, you can bring in the AWS, other services into that environment, things like S3, right? So, okay, that is SharePoint, super, super fast. The only things you need to remember is decide on the environment you want, intranet, extranet, internet. Decide how you're going to authenticate, AD, on-prem, in the cloud, federation. And then the last bit is how you're going to make it all highly available. That's the only things you need to think about from the SharePoint environment. And then finally, custom development if you want to do custom development inside of the SharePoint environment. Now moving on to Exchange super fast. This should have been an entire session. Oh, the last thing I will talk about is just really quickly on load balancing. ELB, the Elastic Load Balancer, our network load balancer, if it's all within a single VPC, you're going to have to use a third-party load balancer with SharePoint. Thing like HA Proxy or NetScaler from Citrix or F5 or whatever your load balancer of choice actually is. If you're using it for internet scenarios, pure sort of HTTP scenarios over public internet, then ELB will work fine for you. So that's just something to think about as well. OK. That's the quickest I've actually. Oh, though I need to talk about testing. I forgot. The other quick thing around testing it and deploying it is obviously follow the recommendations from Microsoft in terms of system requirements. Microsoft does have this thing called the load testing kit for SharePoint that allows you to simulate load against SharePoint and understand how long it takes to upload, download, how many users, those sorts of things inside of your environment. You will want to test the data tier. A couple of tools that I recommend is SQL.io, which will actually go out and test the subsystem. So this is me running SQL.io against my EBS. It's my SQL Server running on EBS inside of here. It will tell you sort of the throughput that you get and whether you can handle the levels of workloads that you want, as well as Performance Monitor. you'll want to take a look at Performance Monitor running inside of your environment. The other thing, too, from a SharePoint standpoint is RPS, or requests per second, is the thing that you're going to want to use to measure SharePoint performance. This is the number of HTTP requests that can come into SharePoint that is serviced back out to the client. You don't want these things queuing up because that means SharePoint is just spinning around and it's taking 30 seconds to render out the team site to the user. So definitely, when you measure your performance on AWS and SharePoint, you will want to take a look at requests per second and make sure that you are not queuing those requests. And then finally, for custom developers, SharePoint has a capability called the Developer Dashboard that you can enable onto your SharePoint site running inside of AWS. And it will tell you where the actual sort of slowness in your code actually is, whether it's your code, SharePoint itself, how many SQL calls it's making, what type of SQL calls it's making, all those sorts of things. So it's a really good way to X-ray into both your custom code and the SharePoint environment to understand what's actually happening. And then finally, we do ship a sample PowerShell to CloudWatch metrics. So CloudWatch is our monitoring tool inside of AWS. We do have PowerShell commandlets, so you can take CPU, memory, disk, push those to CloudWatch, and alarm on them for Windows instances. So if your Windows instance is running out of disk, you can get an alarm. If the CPU is more than 50% utilized, you can get an alarm and do something. So you'll want to definitely take a look and download the PowerShell to CloudWatch scripts that we built for your actual testing and also deployments. And then this is, you'll see these slides. This just tells you if you really want a highly available public internet architecture, it tells you all the things you should deploy. Right? So again, in the interest of time, I will just move ahead here to Exchange. And this is the code, all that sort of stuff. Right? OK. Anyway, Exchange. So Exchange, you can have multiple Exchange servers inside of an environment, whether on-prem or online. Usually, you don't have multiple Exchange organizations. Right? You don't have like 2 email systems running inside of Exchange. You may stretch an on-prem Exchange into a cloud environment. The first thing to think about is, do you want Exchange all on-prem, Exchange all online, or sort of a hybrid environment, right? Where you've got some Exchange running on premises for a certain set of users, some Exchange running online inside of AWS, and you can connect those together. We do fully support that environment. Again, you'll look at our virtual private cloud and our VPN, our virtual private network, to be able to securely connect back to your on-premises environment and evaluate that. Again, authentication, very similar to SharePoint. You decide where your domain controllers live, all on-prem, all online, mixture of both inside of your environment. Unlike SharePoint, Exchange, you probably will not use like ADFS or Federation for that technology. You may, but the more common scenario is you'll run full domain controllers and authenticate against those full domain controllers. Exchange doesn't have sort of an extranet scenario, right? You have a mailbox inside of the Exchange system. HADR. So Exchange supports this technology called database availability groups. Again, we recommend that you deploy them multi-AZ. So if an AZ goes down, you could deploy them in a single AZ if you want. But if that AZ goes away, you're in trouble. So we would recommend multi-AZ. The other thing, too, is you can take EBS snapshots or use the native backup of Exchange to actually back up your Exchange environment. And you can do all of these things. Right? They're not either or. So for the most highly available environment, we would say use database availability groups and also take EBS snapshots of your EC2 environment to get the highest HADR inside of your system. And then network load balancing. Again, you will need a third-party network load balancer for Exchange. ELB will not work with Exchange today because of the way RPC over HTTP works inside of the Exchange environment. So you will want to take a look at third-party. Microsoft has a product called UAG, the Unified Access Gateway. Or again, you can use things like HAProxy, NetScaler, F5, those sorts of things inside of your environment. Theoretically, in Exchange 2013, this problem goes away. But we have not tested it yet. So I will not say that we fully support it, but it is something that we will test and actually publish documentation on. So with Exchange, in terms of testing your deployment on AWS, there's a couple of tools that I would recommend. The first one is something called JetStress. JetStress, so Jet is the name of the database under Exchange. Exchange does not use SQL Server. It uses this product called Jet from way back when. JetStress actually will stress test your environment to make sure that you have enough I/O capacity to actually run Exchange inside of that environment. We've run JetStress many times against EBS. And you can either decide, again, it depends on how big your Exchange deployment actually is. With EBS, a lot of times you can get away with without provisioned IOPS, our new provisioned IOPS inside of EBS. But for very large Exchange deployments, you probably will look at using something like PIOPS inside of EBS to guarantee 1,000 or 2,000 I/O operations a second in order to support a large-scale sort of Exchange mailbox environment. But I would definitely recommend taking a look at jet stress and running it inside of the AWS environment to make sure that your EBS backend will handle all the stress that's coming into the jet database. The other thing, too, is also Exchange has a technology called load gen, or load generator. This allows you to simulate load on your Exchange environment, and you can customize the type of load that it is. Is it ActiveSync users coming in from their mobile devices? Is it Outlook Web Access users coming in through the web? Is it Outlook users? Are they light users? Are they heavy users? Do they use more calendar than they do email or tasks than they do calendar? Those sorts of things. You can set up the environment and then actually run the load gen inside of your environment, and we'll tell you whether you can actually handle that capacity or not, and where the failure was inside of the environment. Was it that you didn't have enough I/O throughput? Was it on the sort of the client access server was falling over? Those sorts of things here. So I would definitely recommend taking a look at the load gen tools and actually trying those out before you deploy your production Exchange environment. And then the last thing is, when you're trying, the biggest problem with email is connectivity, right? The second that email goes down, the help desk gets the call, right? It's like one of these things, it's like the telephone, right? People don't want these things to be down. And a lot of times when you're dealing with Exchange, Exchange has a complex sort of network topology that it requires. Are you coming over ActiveSync? Well, ActiveSync comes in through a different protocol stack than maybe something like Exchange Outlook on-prem, right? So the Microsoft team released this thing called the Remote Connectivity Analyzer that allows you to say, what is my type of client coming in, and can I actually get to the endpoint that you're actually giving me? And I'll show you a demo of this. This is a good way to troubleshoot, is the problem on my end, or is the problem on sort of a client access method that's trying to come into my Exchange server system? I would definitely recommend taking a look at this tool when you're evaluating Exchange and when you have it in deployment, because this will help you pinpoint where the issues are. Let's say SMTP emails not coming in, or let's say your mobile devices can't connect. This will help you troubleshoot what actually is happening between that endpoint and your actual Exchange deployment. And then this is an Exchange architecture diagram. Rather than showing you that, let me show you a quick demo here. So Exchange, that's my real Outlook. So the first thing that I was going to show you here is, so with Exchange, I deployed Exchange here in a highly available environment. So unlike SharePoint, where I put AD on one server and SQL and SharePoint just to demo 2013 to you, this is a 2010 deployment with failover clustering using the database availability groups of Exchange. AD is highly available. Exchange is highly available inside of this environment. It's made up of about, I think, 12 to 16 instances running inside of EC2 in a multi-AZ configuration. The first thing that I want to show you is just a little bit of the failover clustering. One of the questions we get in Windows in EC2 is, do you support failover clustering for Windows? And the answer is, it depends, right, unfortunately. Because different technologies implement and use clustering in different ways. I will sit here and tell you we do support failover clustering using database availability groups inside of Exchange in a multi-AZ deployment. And you'll actually see me fail over in a couple of seconds inside the Exchange environment. SQL Server 2012, the database availability groups, we will be testing that. But we should be able to support that as well. The scenarios that we will not support today is scenarios that require shared disk inside of a failover cluster. So failover clusters, sometimes they require you to have a shared disk inside of there that both nodes in the cluster talk to. Today, EBS does not allow two instances to talk to a single EBS VOM. It's only attached to a single instance. So for those scenarios, if let's say, connectivity issues. Okay, let that go. It will connect in a second. If you find that the cluster requirements for the application does require a shared disk instance, that will not work inside of the AWS environment. But if there's feedback from you that is something that's super, super critical, please let me know, and we can see if we can work around that. But you can see here I've got two nodes inside of my failover cluster, CA demo EX03 and CA demo EX04. I have networks connecting these clusters, so you have the heartbeat between the nodes. So that if one node dies, the heartbeat says, oh, that node died, let me fail over to the other node inside the system and continue to serve the requests that are coming in. And I'm going to connect to my Exchange box now here. And so here I've got Outlook Web Access, just my little mailbox running inside of my highly available Exchange environment. I send a little test message to myself. First thing that we're going to want to make sure of is that we have connectivity to the system. So here's this remote connectivity analyzer from Microsoft. So you can see here I can have ActiveSync. I can use Exchange Web Services to connect up and try that endpoint. I can try and connect like I'm Outlook. Or I can try and connect just standard SMTP tests inside of the environment. And so here I will just go perform a quick test like I am an Outlook client in here. Have to put in my email address. My domain. This is, again, AD all running in the cloud. So there's no on-prem inside of here. My password. And of course, it's a strong password, not a weak password. I'm going to use Outlook Auto Discovery. So I don't, one of the nice things about Exchange is Outlook doesn't have to know what server it's on. It will auto discover that for you. That's also very useful in high availability environments because Outlook will just reconnect and discover the server that it should connect to. And then Microsoft requires you, so you're not like a spammer or someone taking them down, this CAPTCHA inside of here. Let's hope I typed that right. Does everyone agree that that is the right? I can never tell them these things. I'll verify. I am verified. OK, good. And then I just go and click this Perform Test. And now it's going to go off and actually perform the test. We won't wait for it to finish. I ran it earlier. You'll see here, this is what it actually does. It auto-discovers, connects up, makes sure it's my SSL certificate's valid. It does my IRS configuration, make sure that is valid as well for HTTPS. Goes up, connects to the endpoint. Imagine doing this all yourself. Right? That would take you a bunch of time. Here it does all that automation for you and tells you, here's all the steps that actually worked inside of your environment. So again, whether you're evaluating or deploying, this is a great tool to use inside of your Exchange environment. Now let's go to the Exchange administration console. So this is the Exchange management console. For those of you running 2010, it should be familiar to you. Here you'll see I'm just looking at my mailboxes contained inside of here. You see I've got this mailbox here that's mounted. Mailbox 1 is mounted currently on EX04. And this is my copy. My database availability group is made up of 2 nodes. And it's actually, the copy status is healthy. So I've got one primary mailbox that I'm connecting to, and then it's actually copying it over. So it's highly available in another AZ for me, just in case the primary AZ goes down. Now, I could terminate my instance, which I won't do because there's other people on this server using demos. What I will actually do to simulate a failure here is I will actually move the mailbox from the one that is mounted today to the other node. So effectively, it's going to fail over to the other copy of the database. So I'm just going to use this activate a database copy here. You see it's mounted on server 04 today. I'm going to go tell it to mount it on 03. Click move. Let's all cross our fingers. There we go. It's going to run it. And again, to show you that I'm not lying to you, so it's going to go do it. Go Exchange. Go Exchange. Give it a sec. And if that all is failing over, I should get an error in Outlook Web Access, right? So it says, hey, look, your mailbox isn't available right now. It's failing over to another location. Your instance died, effectively. And I got to give it a little bit of time to actually recover here. Let's see if... There we go. So it actually moved it over. It said, hey, look, I actually completed the operation. And if I go back to Outlook Web Access here, click Close, just do a quick refresh of the thing. There's my Exchange mailbox. I can click around inside of here and see all my different messages inside of there. Right, so there you go, high availability Exchange deployment inside of AWS. Right, so pretty straightforward inside of there. All right. The other thing, too, that I just wanted to show you here quickly, and again, I don't have a lot on here, is that was Exchange 2010. The other thing that we support, too, is also Exchange 2013. So here's an Exchange 2013 environment. This is the new Outlook Web Access running inside of Exchange 2013. And again, I won't go into all the different capabilities of the Outlook Web Access environment inside of here. But we do fully support Exchange 2013. We'll publish documentation on that. One of the key things that is nice for Exchange 2013 that makes it nicer to host it inside of a public cloud environment, is the Exchange management console now is all web-based. So before you saw when I connected up to the Exchange management console, it was through a Windows-based app, effectively. Here, this is the new Exchange administration console. You can see it's all just inside of a standard web browser. So from any endpoint, I don't have to be on a Windows box in order to actually go administer my Exchange environment. I could be on my tablet. I could be on my Linux box. I could be on whatever it is, a kiosk at the Las Vegas airport, in order to be able to administer my environment. So again, this is Exchange 2013 running inside of AWS. I actually was running load gen against this thing. Those are all the load gen mailboxes inside of there that I was actually testing against. And so you can see this all working inside of the AWS environment. All right. I have 13 minutes left. I went so fast that I have a little bit of time left. Those are just screenshots. So I will have time for questions, thank God. So just really quickly, a couple things that I'll point out here is, number one, definitely go up and hit the Amazon website for /Microsoft/Windows, and then we have a special site for SharePoint that steps you through the SharePoint environment. There's a white paper on SharePoint. There's the CloudFormation templates on SharePoint. The other thing, too, that I would say is also go take a look at the Getting Started guide as well. We do offer a free tier of Windows. So if you've never used Windows on EC2 or AWS, there is a free tier. You get up to 750 hours of our T1 micro instance for free, as long as you meet the requirements of those, the limitations, right? You can't run like, your public internet-facing site and host millions of users. We'll charge you for that because you're using more than the resources that are part of that free tier. But it's a good way for you to start testing out Windows and testing out the Windows environment and testing out some of these technologies. I will say, though, that free tier, if you're going to really do any sort of meaningful evaluation of SharePoint or Exchange, you're probably going to want to run on a bigger instance than the free tier T1 Micro. Right? That is a 613 meg memory box, right, with a sliver of a CPU. Right? You're probably going to want to move to at least a M1 small, medium, large, extra large, or something else for your evaluations, because then you won't get a real flavor for actually evaluating Exchange and SharePoint on the environment. So those are all the content I have. I went through it fast. Are there any questions that I can answer for anyone? Anything?